Education can be instrumental to your child's success, but expenses have gotten completely outrageous, being up over 180% over the last 40 years, and that's just on average, with some cases being much worse. Let's take an example of my hometown of Tempe, Arizona, here with Arizona State University, which used to be only $1,000 per year back in the year 1980, but now in the year 2025, forks up, baby, we're up to $12,000 per year, which that's just the tuition, not to mention the extra fees, living expenses. I mean, it basically doubles that by the time you've actually paid for everything. My name is Grady Cool, CEO of Cool Wealth Management. With an entire alphabet worth of credentials, I am more educated than 99% of financial advisors, and today I'm going to make sure that you know everything you need to know about getting your college education savings for your children taken care of. Let's get into it. First, let's get our heads on straight. Generally, investing well ahead of time, taking advantage of avoiding taxes, and being consistent about it is the most efficient way to save for college or any form of education. That being said, a lot of the best options for saving for school come within just that short window of 1 to 2 years before school, but also within 1 to 2 years within starting school. It can be a lot having to fork over $100,000, sometimes even more, in order to be able to pay for school, but we're going to go through what we can do right now and then what exactly we can do as the time approaches. Starting off strong with the 529 plan. This is the most common option for education savings these days. Within the 529, there are 2 different options. Let's start off with the prepaid tuition plan. The whole idea of this is that if ASU costs $12,000 to go to right now, I'm going to lock in that rate, and then my kid goes there in 15 years, they're still going to pay $12,000. This sounds nice in concept, but there are a few difficulties with some of this. There are quite a few state restrictions in terms of per state. It can be that you can only go within the state. So let's say my child decides that they want to go to University of Arizona instead of Arizona State. Great, they can do that. But if they decide they want to go up to Montana, it might be a little tough. It does vary as far as the rules, but it's something that you really have to keep in mind. The other option is the Education Savings Plan. This provides a lot more flexibility for things beyond just tuition, including things like room and board, other fees, books, anything kind of education related. That being said, always check the rules on your specific state before committing to purchasing anything. One thing you really need to keep in mind with this specific option is it provides a lot more flexibility for where you can go to school. So let's say, again, wants to go up to Montana, not a problem, can actually go there. It is still specific per state, but the general idea is the extra layer of flexibility involved here is the massive benefit to being able to be more realistic for a lot of parents. Taking a step back, let's look at a few of the major pros for both the 529 plans. The first and most obvious of this is the tax benefits. The money in there grows tax-free if you use it on qualified expenses. On top of that, some states even allow for you to reduce your state income taxes for contributions going into that 529. Even better, there are no contribution limits into this. It's almost like I'm foreshadowing for what account types are to come. While it may not be applicable to all of you, one thing to consider as well is that it does get removed from your estate with the contributions you put in. So for a grandparent, this could be something that could be really helpful. For all those benefits, there are some major downfalls. The first thing is that there are only a few funds that you can select within there. So generally what this looks like is you have some where there are a lot of stock, not as much bonds, whereas another one, if you want to be more conservative, maybe there's a lot more bonds and a lot less stock. There's variance in between, but for the most part, you're getting some sort of mutual fund that has varying degrees of risk. While this video is primarily concerned with college and university savings, 529s can be fairly limited as far as what you can do through K through 12, so another thing to keep in mind. The most obvious drawback is that for any money you take out that is not put into qualified expenses, there is a fee and you have to pay the taxes on any sort of earnings you've had on it. Let's take, for example, for confidentiality purposes, we'll say my client's name was Mr. Baggins. Mr. Baggins had a fund left to him from his grandparents who would assume, he'd go to college like grandparents tend to assume. And what happened is that Mr. Baggins decided he didn't want to do that. He wanted to go live off on greater adventures, as Mr. Baggins really did have a grand adventure. That being said, Mr. Baggins did not have a great way to access these funds then, and also couldn't make a ton of money because he didn't have a college education. So he's left out much income, and his life savings are stuck in some plan where he'd have to pay fees and taxes. This is a tricky situation. There are some options for transferring 529s to family members, and with the Secure Act 2.0 introduced in 2024, there are some alternative options for specific situations, but none of which are great for the exact person accessing the money immediately. With all that in mind, 529s are a great option for saving for school if you do the planning right, but they can lead to tricky situations if you don't think ahead of time. If you're going to put your money in there, really make sure your kid wants to go to school. Number 2. Coverdell Education Savings Accounts, otherwise known as a ESA, which will be much easier to say. This is kind of like the awkward brother to the 529. It's not intended that way, but it just kind of worked out that way. Similarly to a 529 plan, money inside of a ESA grows tax-free and can be used for kindergarten through 12th grade or on college expenses. Now let's get into some of the pros of an ESA. The first one being much greater investment flexibility. You can go into things like stocks, ETFs, bonds, mutual funds, cash, even real estate with some restrictions. This is probably a good time for a quick little tangent about what investments you should be picking depending on how old your child is and how much risk you're okay with. If your child doesn't need to go get the money because they're not going to school for another 15 years, generally you have a lot more room to be a little bit more aggressive with things like stocks or real estate. Whereas if your child is going to school in 2 years from now, maybe things that are a little bit more defensive or conservative in nature could be something to consider, such as cash equivalents, things like money market funds, high yield savings account, certificate of deposit. I mean, there's a lot of options. Getting a little bit more aggressive with things like bonds is also an option, whether it be corporate bonds, treasuries, or whatever country you may be interested in. It gets a little bit more tricky when you get into the 6 to 7 years out range. Then you really start talking about how comfortable are you with risk. And ultimately, you just have to decide, am I okay with the idea that whatever money is not available in that account when it's time to draw it out is something I will either have to pay for or child will need a loan for. Coming back to ESAs, they're not state specific, so there's a lot more flexibility again for what school your child can go to. Now we get into some of the awkwardness I was talking about. The ESA does not provide for the same state income tax benefits that some states offer. As well, there's only a $2,000 contribution limit with income levels deciding how much you can put into it. There's a phase out that can happen with it. Look up the numbers before putting any money in. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments or set up an appointment. The ESA is not perfect though. Let's get into a little bit of that awkwardness I was talking about. One just straight up downfall is that ESAs frequently do not get you the same state income tax deduction that a 529 can. The part that's more just kind of a little awkward is that there is a $2,000 contribution limit per year. With that in mind, there's also an income level restriction for how much can go in. For some of you, this might not be a big deal because you were planning on putting $500 in there. For others of you, this could be a major issue because you wanted to put a lot more in. Really depends on the person. Also, while not super applicable for a lot of people, there is a restriction that all the money in the account must be used by the child's 30th birthday. If you can fit the income bracket, it can be a nice little alternative to a 529. Next on our list are Roth IRAs for education. This is basically in the child's name. This can be a little bit more complicated in nature, so I would approach this one carefully. This isn't a super common option because while the money from the IRA can be used to reduce financial aid calculations, need to be careful there. It doesn't get that same tax-free growth. It just avoids that 10% penalty from IRAs that there can be in some contexts. Again, there's a reason this isn't a super common approach, but it is something you should consider depending on your situation if your income tax bracket is just right for this. Then we have the custodial account, or the UGMA or UTMA, depending on when it was made. This is basically a standard brokerage account for a child. This is the same thing of whether it would be in your name or the child's name. So when you're thinking about when to use this, it doesn't make a bunch of difference as far as money goes. That being said, whether the money is in the child's name or in the name of the parent can make a big difference for financial aid calculations, so watch the rest of the video before you end up immediately pulling the trigger on this one. Scholarships, grants, and loans. Now we're talking about the days right before it's time to make the great journey into adulthood. Loans, while they can be a problem, at least allow you to get your foot in the door with school, but I'm primarily going to be talking about scholarships and grants. This is free money that you are getting from different sources. The easiest and most common example of this is if you go to a state university in your local state and you have lived there for a few years, you will frequently get massive deductions in tuition to go to that school. Personally, I grew up here in Arizona, went to high school here, then went to Arizona State University for my undergraduate, and it ended up being less than half of what it would have been otherwise to go somewhere else. Unfortunately, this doesn't apply to graduate school a lot of times. When I did my MBA here at ASU, I still had to pay full price. The next most common thing that happens is a needs-based scholarship. If you are poor, people will frequently give you money to go to school. That's about the sum of it. Another really big option is if your child is a living legend who can just rock it on the sports field, or they're in some super niche sport like badminton or ping pong, then a full ride can be an option. I highly encourage applying for other scholarships besides just these options. The weirder, the better. There are so many scholarships out there from different groups that want to help people just like them get into school and do well in life. The most common example of this is race, ethnicity, and nationality. Isn't applicable for everybody, but definitely a good starting point. Another common example is for things like diseases. I personally have rheumatoid arthritis, so this opens a lot of doors for me to be able to apply to things. Didn't know at the time. But this is a perfect time in life to be able to take advantage of your miseries for free money. There are millions of dollars of free money and scholarships left unclaimed every single year, so really try to get applications out there. You can even apply for scholarships while you're still in school. People don't even realize this. You can just keep applying freshman, sophomore, junior year, and a lot of times it's even more likely to get you the scholarship. One, because there's less competition, but two, they know you're actually going to be in school. When you're a senior, if it's October and you're going to school in August of the next year, that's a lot of time for someone to drop out. Whereas if you're already in school, they know for a fact that this scholarship will go somewhere. I had a friend while I was in college. She applied for scholarships her whole freshman and sophomore year and ended up saving another $10,000, $20,000, somewhere in that range. That she saved a lot of money in the process because there just wasn't anyone else applying for those specific scholarships. Bringing everything together here. You have 529, which is your gold standard. Check it out first. ESA, awkward little brother. If you need a different option, good place to go with. Roth IRA, which can be a little bit tricky, so be careful there. And then as the time approaches, we have scholarships, grants, and even loans if we end up needing them. Really trying to check what options are available at the time. The big key to success here is planning and saving ahead of time and trying to do everything that we can because we do have options. If you have any questions about what to do with your specific situation, definitely check out the link in the description to schedule an appointment with me. Otherwise, comment section would be happy to help with. And other than that, I hope you guys have a good one. Bye.